The halls of Congress buzzed with anticipation as Karoline Leavitt, the fiery young Republican representative, prepared for her moment in the spotlight. The heated debate over immigration policy had reached a boiling point, and Karoline had been itching for this very moment. As she stepped to the podium, the usual suspects, AOC and Ilhan Omar, exchanged smug glances from their seats on the left side of the chamber. The room fell silent as Karoline began her speech. She was known for her unflinching rhetoric and sharp delivery, but no one could have predicted the bombshell she was about to drop. With a pause that sent a ripple of unease through the room, Karoline spoke with a cool, measured tone. "You've all heard the stories," she began, eyes sweeping across the room. "You've heard the accusations about the integrity of our borders and the promises made by our representatives. But what if I told you that one of your own, one of the loudest voices in support of unchecked immigration, might be in violation of the very laws they claim to protect?" AOC's eyebrows shot up, and Ilhan's expression hardened. Karoline had their attention. Karoline continued, her voice growing stronger. "That's right. I'm talking about Congresswoman Ilhan Omar. The very person who spends her time lecturing us on open borders and amnesty might soon be facing charges of her own, charges that could result in her deportation." "Yes, you heard me right. Deportation." The room erupted in murmurs and gasps. Karoline paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. She could see AOC's eyes narrow in disbelief, and Ilhan's fists clench under the desk. "You see, folks," Karoline went on, "there's a little-known clause in immigration law that's being investigated as we speak. If the allegations against her prove true, Ilhan Omar may have falsified documents upon entering this country, and if that's the case, there could be serious consequences, up to and including deportation." The shockwaves in the chamber were palpable. It wasn't just the claim itself that left everyone reeling, it was the implications. AOC and Ilhan, both seen as champions of progressive policies, were now in the crosshairs. Karoline knew this was just the beginning. The question now wasn't whether the bombshell would shake things up, it already had. The question was how far it would go. The fallout was immediate. AOC and Ilhan Omar sat motionless, their faces unreadable, but anyone who had been paying attention knew this was no ordinary political strike. This was personal. The silence in the chamber was thick, the air charged with tension. Karoline's words still hung in the air like a lingering smoke, and the buzz that erupted after she had finished speaking was deafening. Members from both sides of the aisle whispered in hushed tones, exchanging shocked looks. Karoline had been a rising star in the Republican Party, but this? This was something else. It wasn't long before AOC stood, her chair scraping loudly against the marble floor. She was known for her quick temper, but this moment, this public challenge, seemed to have caught her off guard. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was cold and controlled. "Karoline," she began, her eyes locking with Karoline's across the room, "this kind of rhetoric has no place in our politics. You want to tear down a fellow woman of color, a fellow immigrant? This is not about policy, it's about playing to the lowest, most divisive instincts of our country. And I won't stand for it." The tension only increased as Ilhan Omar, who had been uncharacteristically silent, now stood as well. Her voice was calm, almost too calm. "Karoline," she said, her tone icy, "this is a desperate attempt to undermine everything I've worked for and everything I stand for. You may have done your homework, but you've got it all wrong. There's nothing to this claim. It's a smear, a baseless accusation that has no merit whatsoever. I will not be intimidated by your lies." But Karoline didn't flinch. She was ready for this. She had expected it, and it was all part of the plan. "You can deny it all you want, Ilhan," Karoline shot back. "But the facts speak for themselves. You've made a career out of championing open borders, lecturing the American people about immigration laws while allegedly breaking those same laws yourself. Now, you have to answer for it." The chamber seemed to hold its breath as Karoline paused for effect. Her words were calculated, each one a dart aimed directly at Ilhan and AOC. If you're so confident that there's nothing to these allegations, then why aren't you demanding an investigation? Why not clear your name? You know, it's strange how quickly you both jump to defend each other, but when the truth comes knocking, suddenly it's all about playing the victim. The people deserve to know the truth. The room erupted again, this time with mixed reactions. Some applauded Karoline's boldness, while others stood in staunch defense of AOC and Ilhan. A few Republicans looked uneasy, unsure of the direction this was headed. But the majority of the room was transfixed. As the chaos unfolded, Karoline felt the weight of the moment. She knew this was more than just a political fight, it was a battle for the narrative. The questions would now multiply. Would the investigation into Ilhan Omar be launched? Would this be the beginning of the end for the two progressive powerhouses? But Karoline wasn't done yet. She had one more card to play. I've spoken to sources, inside and outside of Congress, who have confirmed that this investigation is very real, Karoline continued, her voice now unwavering. And when the truth comes out, it won't just be Ilhan Omar who is facing consequences. AOC, you may want to start preparing yourself too. This investigation is only just beginning. Her words sent another wave of shock through the room. AOC's face twitched slightly, but she maintained her composure. Ilhan, however, had turned pale, a hint of fear finally showing in her eyes. The showdown had only just begun. The days following Karoline's bombshell were a blur of headlines, interviews, and an escalating political firestorm. The accusation that Ilhan Omar could face deportation had not just caught the attention of Congress, it had ignited a national debate. The media frenzy was relentless, with pundits and reporters hounding the story at every angle. Karoline's gamble had worked, but the stakes were higher now than ever before. Ilhan Omar, usually unshakable, had gone into hiding, issuing only brief, defiant statements. AOC, meanwhile, took to social media, posting videos and tweets in a desperate bid to rally her supporters. We will not let this kind of political attack define our movement. She tweeted, but even her fans couldn't ignore the growing pressure. People were starting to question if there was any truth to the allegations. Behind the scenes, Karoline's allies were working tirelessly. She had already secured several whistleblowers from the Department of Homeland Security, and their stories confirmed that an internal investigation into Omar's immigration status had been underway for weeks. The whispers about her possible falsified documents were gaining traction. It didn't take long for the House Oversight Committee to announce that they would hold hearings. Karoline was invited to testify as the lead witness. It was an unprecedented move, one that could change the course of the investigation entirely. On the morning of the hearing, the atmosphere in the Capitol was electric. Karoline walked into the hearing room with a quiet confidence. Her team had already prepared a series of documents and affidavits, all pointing to potential violations of federal immigration laws by Ilhan Omar. As Karoline took her seat, she glanced over at AOC and Ilhan, who were sitting across from her. They looked uneasy, more than just the pressure of the spotlight. It was as if they knew the walls were closing in. The chairman of the committee, a no-nonsense Republican representative, called the room to order. The questions would start immediately. Representative Levitt, the chairman began, "You've stated that there is evidence to suggest that Congresswoman Omar may have falsified documents upon entering the United States. Can you elaborate on that claim for the record?" Karoline stood, taking a deep breath before speaking. "Yes, Mr. Chairman. I've obtained documents from reliable sources inside DHS that confirm an ongoing investigation into Congresswoman Omar's immigration status. There are discrepancies in her entry documents, particularly concerning her claimed refugee status. The evidence suggests that she may have misrepresented key details when entering this country. These are serious violations of federal law." There was a collective gasp from the audience. AOC's face flushed with anger, but she said nothing. Ilhan, on the other hand, shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her hands gripping the edges of the table. "We have witnesses who can corroborate these claims," Karoline continued, her voice steady. "I'm not here to make wild accusations. I'm here to ensure that the truth comes to light, no matter how uncomfortable it may be for some." The room was stunned into silence. The committee members exchanged glances, unsure of how to proceed. Karoline had just made her case in front of a national audience, and the evidence she referenced was undeniable. Then came the moment that would alter the course of the investigation. The chairman turned to Ilhan Omar, who had remained silent until now. "Congresswoman Omar," the chairman began, "how do you respond to these allegations?" Ilhan looked up, her voice sharp and defensive. "These are lies. Plain and simple. I've been a lawful permanent resident and later a naturalized citizen of the United States. These claims are nothing more than a political stunt, an attempt to discredit me and distract from the real issues facing this country." The room buzzed with disbelief. Karoline knew that Omar's deflection wasn't going to be enough. Her allies had the receipts, documents, testimonies, even surveillance footage from the time of Omar's entry into the U.S. The evidence was damning. Just as Ilhan finished speaking, Karoline's attorney handed over a thick file to the chairman. "Mr. Chairman, I would like to submit this as evidence," Karoline said, her eyes never leaving Ilhan's. "This file contains the full report on the discrepancies in Congresswoman Omar's immigration records. It's time for the truth to come out." The committee chairman took the file, nodding. "We will review this immediately." For a moment, the room was eerily still. Everyone knew what was coming. The public hearings, the investigations, this was no longer just a political brawl. The integrity of two powerful progressives was on the line. And as the chairman called for a brief recess, Karoline felt the weight of the moment. This wasn't just about her career, it was about a nation watching to see whether the political elite would be held accountable for their actions. Outside the hearing room, reporters crowded around Karoline, microphones thrust toward her. "Do you think Omar will be held accountable?" one asked. Karoline didn't hesitate. "This investigation is far from over. But one thing is clear, the truth will win out. We've only just begun." As the cameras flashed, Karoline knew that the next phase of the battle would be even more intense. The pressure was mounting, and soon, everyone would be forced to confront the reality of what had been uncovered. And for Ilhan Omar, the truth might be far more dangerous than anyone had imagined. The days after the hearing were a blur of mounting pressure and rising stakes. Karoline's bombshell had ignited a firestorm across the political landscape, and the fallout from the investigation into Ilhan Omar's immigration record seemed to intensify with each passing hour. But as the weeks dragged on, it became clear that this wasn't just about one congresswoman's potential legal troubles, it had become a fight for the soul of American politics. Karoline's supporters rallied behind her, calling for swift justice, while her detractors attacked her with accusations of partisanship and exploitation of a woman of color's personal history for political gain. The media circus surrounding Ilhan Omar was relentless, with every new report heightening the uncertainty around her future. In the days following the hearing, Ilhan made several public appearances, trying to maintain her composure while deflecting the allegations. Her team of high-powered lawyers worked around the clock, scrambling to discredit the evidence Karoline had presented. But despite their best efforts, the narrative was shifting, and it seemed more and more likely that the investigation would lead to significant consequences. Then came the shocking twist, the moment that would change everything. On the evening of a particularly heated debate on the House floor, Karoline was informed by one of her most trusted sources within DHS that new, irrefutable evidence had been uncovered. The files Karoline had already submitted were just the tip of the iceberg. A key witness, one of the officials responsible for processing Omar's immigration paperwork, had come forward with even more explosive testimony. The witness claimed that, under pressure, they had been coerced into signing off on false documents related to Omar's refugee status, and that there were clear indications of fraud in her entry process. The revelation was so damaging that it left little room for ambiguity. Karoline knew this could be the breakthrough that would finally force the investigation into overdrive. The very next day, Karoline addressed the media with a new statement, her demeanor calm but determined. "I stand by the evidence I've presented, and today, I'm announcing that we have uncovered new, irrefutable proof that Congresswoman Ilhan Omar entered this country under false pretenses. A whistleblower from within the Department of Homeland Security has come forward, and their testimony, combined with the existing documentation, makes it clear that Congresswoman Omar's immigration records are fraudulent. The shockwaves were immediate. Karoline's words were met with gasps, followed by a flurry of questions from the press. AOC, who had been a vocal defender of Ilhan, immediately went on the attack. "This is nothing but a continued smear campaign against my colleague," she fired back. "These allegations are baseless and politically motivated. Ilhan Omar is a fighter for justice, and this is just another attempt to silence her." But Karoline remained unfazed, knowing that the evidence she had now was too powerful to ignore. It wasn't just about the claims anymore, it was about the proof. The witness statement was game-changing. The fact that someone within DHS had come forward and confirmed the fraudulent documents made it much harder for even the most ardent defenders of Ilhan Omar to dismiss the investigation as a partisan attack. As the investigation ramped up, the pressure on Ilhan and AOC became unbearable. Rumors swirled that more witnesses were preparing to testify, that even more evidence would soon be uncovered. And with every passing day, the calls for accountability grew louder, not just from Republicans but from moderates and independents who had once been hesitant to take a side. Then, in an unprecedented move, the Department of Homeland Security officially announced that it had launched a full-scale investigation into Ilhan Omar's immigration records. The announcement hit like a thunderclap across the nation. Ilhan Omar had gone from a defender of the underprivileged and a fierce voice for progressive causes to the focus of an international controversy. She was now under official investigation, with the possibility of facing criminal charges, including deportation. The pressure was becoming unbearable for Omar. She had fought hard for years to establish herself as a leading voice in Congress, and now it all seemed to be unraveling before her eyes. But even as her world was crashing down around her, she refused to back down. She held a press conference to deflect the mounting accusations, but it was clear to everyone in the room that her position had become increasingly untenable. "I will not be silenced by this smear campaign," Ilhan declared defiantly, standing before a sea of cameras. "I've dedicated my life to fighting for justice, and I will continue to do so, no matter the obstacles in my way. This country has given me the opportunity to serve, and I will not allow these politically motivated attacks to stop me from doing the work I was elected to do." But as she spoke, the tension in the room was palpable. The once unwavering confidence in her voice was now tinged with a hint of desperation. The allegations were no longer just an inconvenience, they were a threat to her political career, her reputation, and possibly even her freedom. As the press conference ended, Karoline Leavitt stood in front of her camera, a small, knowing smile on her lips. The battle was far from over, but the tide was turning in her favor. The investigation into Ilhan Omar had gained unprecedented momentum, and now it seemed that nothing could stop it. But the question remained, how far would this investigation go, and would the truth finally come to light, or would the powerful figures behind the scenes manage to protect one of their own, no matter the cost? For Karoline, the answer was clear. The truth would always come out, no matter how much they tried to bury it. And she was ready for whatever came next. The investigation into Ilhan Omar's immigration records was no longer just a congressional matter, it had evolved into a full-blown national spectacle. News outlets from every corner of the country were covering the drama around the clock, and the pressure on all parties involved reached a fever pitch. Karoline Leavitt had set the stage, but now, as the pieces of the puzzle fell into place, the true scale of the consequences was beginning to unfold. Ilhan Omar had tried to maintain her composure, but the cracks were starting to show. The evidence was undeniable, and it seemed that the walls were closing in. The Department of Homeland Security's investigation had made significant progress, and the new whistleblower's testimony had made it clear that the issues surrounding Omar's immigration were far more serious than anyone could have imagined. Despite the mounting pressure, Ilhan refused to give up. She issued a defiant statement, promising to continue fighting for justice, for the people who had elected her. But the more she spoke, the more desperate she sounded. Even her staunchest supporters began to question whether the truth would come out in her favor. The whispers in the corridors of Congress grew louder, and it was clear that this wasn't just about politics anymore, it was about personal survival. Behind closed doors, the Democratic leadership was in crisis mode. AOC and other progressive leaders were scrambling to protect Ilhan, but the allegations were too damaging. They knew that if the investigation reached its conclusion and the truth about Omar's immigration fraud was exposed, it would not only destroy her career, it could damage the entire progressive movement. The stakes had never been higher. The situation had reached a boiling point when a special hearing was called by the House Oversight Committee. This time, Karoline Leavitt was summoned to testify again. This was it, the moment that could seal Ilhan Omar's fate. Karoline had prepared herself for what was to come. She knew that this would be her final opportunity to push her case forward, to ensure that the truth was fully exposed. The hearing room was packed. The media were there in full force, cameras flashing, microphones poised. The public was watching closely, and Karoline's supporters were bracing for the next wave of revelations. Karoline's presence was commanding, she stood tall, her voice unwavering. She was no longer just a young congresswoman, she was a force to be reckoned with. As the hearing began, the committee chairman called on Karoline to present the latest evidence. The documents she had submitted, including the new witness testimony from DHS, were now part of the official record. Karoline wasted no time. "Mr. Chairman, thank you for this opportunity," Karoline began, her eyes scanning the room. "What we are witnessing today is not just about one individual. It's about the integrity of our government and the rule of law. Congresswoman Ilhan Omar, despite her public statements, is under investigation for falsifying documents when entering this country. The facts are clear. The evidence is damning. And it is time for the American people to know the truth." She motioned to a large screen behind her, which displayed the newly uncovered evidence, immigration forms, dates of entry, signatures, and corroborating statements from key witnesses. Each piece of the puzzle fit perfectly, making it impossible for anyone to deny that something had gone horribly wrong in Omar's entry process. AOC, seated across from Karoline, was visibly tense, her face a mask of controlled anger. She had been pushing back against the investigation every step of the way, but now, even she seemed to be losing her grip on the narrative. The mounting evidence left little room for denial. Ilhan Omar, who was seated next to AOC, appeared pale. She had been avoiding eye contact with Karoline, but now, she couldn't ignore the reality of the situation. The walls were closing in. "Congresswoman Omar," Karoline said, her voice ringing out with authority, "you've had every opportunity to clear your name. You've had every chance to address these allegations. But the evidence speaks for itself. This isn't just an oversight, it's a matter of national security and integrity." Ilhan, her voice shaky but defensive, stood up to respond. "This is an attack on my character, an attack on my work, and an attack on my constituents. I have done nothing wrong, and I will continue to fight against these lies." But Karoline wasn't done. "You can continue to claim that, Congresswoman," Karoline said, her gaze never leaving Ilhan's, "but it's hard to deny the truth when it's laid out for the world to see. Your supporters deserve better than this. The American people deserve better than this. And the rule of law demands accountability." The room fell silent as Karoline's words echoed in the chamber. This was no longer just a political fight, it was a test of whether the political elite could be held accountable for their actions. The committee chairman, his face grim, turned to Ilhan. "Congresswoman Omar, we have all the evidence we need. The Department of Homeland Security has confirmed the authenticity of the witness testimony. We will proceed with a full investigation, and if these allegations are confirmed, the consequences will be severe." Ilhan's face drained of color. She sat back down, her hands trembling. The fight she had waged for years was now in jeopardy, and the possibility of her facing deportation was no longer a distant threat, it was a real and imminent possibility. Karoline Leavitt stood tall, a quiet sense of victory settling over her. This was the culmination of everything she had fought for. The truth was finally coming to light, and there was no turning back. As the hearing concluded and the media swarmed around her, Karoline felt a rush of satisfaction. This wasn't just about exposing Ilhan Omar, it was about restoring faith in the system, showing that no one was above the law, no matter how powerful or untouchable they might seem. But as Karoline stepped out of the hearing room, she knew the battle wasn't over yet. The investigation would continue, and more revelations would surely follow. But for now, one thing was clear, Karoline had set the stage for a reckoning, and nothing would ever be the same again. The media coverage after Karoline's testimony was explosive. News outlets from every corner of the country began to focus on the details of the investigation, and the pressure on Ilhan Omar and her supporters became unbearable. The evidence was mounting, and the public was demanding answers. Karoline had successfully shifted the narrative, but the battle was far from over. As the investigation into Omar's immigration status continued, there were increasing calls from both sides of the aisle for her to step down. The whispers grew louder, whispers of potential charges, of political ruin, and of the fallout that could shake the very foundations of Congress. Karoline, however, remained steadfast, pushing forward with her crusade for accountability, knowing that this moment could define her future in politics. Behind closed doors, Democratic leaders were in full crisis mode. AOC, who had been fiercely defending Ilhan, found herself isolated. Her supporters were beginning to ask hard questions, and the mounting evidence left little room for her to keep defending the indefensible. She had tried to turn the tide with impassioned speeches and social media posts, but nothing seemed to work. Her usual tactics of turning the debate into a moral argument were starting to fall flat. Meanwhile, Ilhan was spiraling. The investigation had gone from a mere inconvenience to a full-blown existential threat. She'd become the center of a scandal that overshadowed everything else, her past, her record, her identity. The very foundation of her career was now at risk. In a rare moment of vulnerability, Ilhan met with AOC behind closed doors to discuss her next steps. The room was heavy with tension as they sat across from each other. "I don't know how much longer I can keep this up," Ilhan said. "The investigation, it's all so much. It feels like everyone is turning against me." AOC looked at her friend with a mix of sympathy and frustration. "Ilhan, I don't know how we can get out of this. Every time you speak, it feels like we're digging ourselves deeper. The truth, it's out there now. We can't pretend it's not." Ilhan's eyes burned with anger. "So you think I should just step down? Let them win?" AOC hesitated. "I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that we're losing control of the narrative, and we need to prepare ourselves for the worst. If this investigation goes all the way, the consequences could be devastating." Ilhan slammed her hand on the table. "I didn't come this far to let Karoline Leavitt and her ilk take me down. I'll fight this to the end. I'm not going anywhere." But even as she spoke with defiance, Ilhan knew deep down that the walls were closing in. The truth was catching up with her, and no matter how much she fought, she couldn't outrun it forever. As the days went by, the investigation's scope expanded. New witnesses came forward, each with more damaging information. One of the most shocking developments came when it was revealed that Omar's refugee status, which had been the cornerstone of her entry into the United States, may have been based on fraudulent claims of family ties that didn't exist. This new revelation sent shockwaves through Congress, and the idea of deportation, once considered a distant possibility, was now an unavoidable reality. The political landscape shifted dramatically. Democratic leaders who had once stood by Ilhan began to distance themselves, some issuing public statements calling for a full and thorough investigation. Even AOC, who had been her staunchest defender, found herself in an increasingly precarious position. She could no longer deny the severity of the situation. The progressive movement was fractured, and the very unity they had fought so hard to build seemed to be unraveling at the seams. Then came the moment that everyone had been waiting for. The Department of Homeland Security officially announced that they would be moving forward with formal charges against Ilhan Omar for immigration fraud. The news hit the airwaves with the force of a tidal wave, and the political world was rocked. In a televised statement, the DHS made it clear that the evidence gathered during the investigation pointed to multiple instances of fraud and misrepresentation in Omar's immigration application. The charges were serious: fraudulent immigration documents, perjury, and potentially even involvement in an organized effort to circumvent U.S. immigration laws. For Ilhan, this was the breaking point. The pressure was unbearable. Her allies in Congress, including AOC, had tried to rally behind her, but even they couldn't ignore the magnitude of the charges. The public was no longer focused on her political platform, they were fixated on the scandal that had engulfed her. On the day of the announcement, Ilhan stood before a crowd of reporters, her face pale and drawn. Her usual defiance had been replaced with a grim resignation. She took a deep breath before speaking. Today, the Department of Homeland Security has announced that I am facing charges related to my immigration process. While I maintain that I have always acted in good faith, I will cooperate fully with the investigation. I will fight these charges, and I will continue to serve the people who elected me. But even as she spoke, the reality was sinking in. The battle for her political survival was no longer about defending her policies or her beliefs, it was about defending herself from the full force of the law. As the cameras flashed and reporters shouted questions, Karoline Leavitt watched from a distance. The outcome of this investigation was far from certain, but one thing was clear: Karoline had set the stage for a political earthquake, and the aftershocks would be felt for years to come. For Karoline, the victory was bittersweet. This wasn't just about winning, it was about exposing the truth, no matter how ugly it was. And with the investigation moving forward, the truth was slowly coming to light, piece by piece. What would happen next was anyone's guess, but Karoline knew one thing: the political world would never be the same again. The months following the formal charges against Ilhan Omar were a whirlwind of legal battles, public outcry, and unrelenting media coverage. The investigation into her immigration fraud became one of the most scrutinized legal cases in American history, captivating the nation. With each passing day, the truth became harder to ignore, and the consequences of her actions seemed increasingly inevitable. As the legal process unfolded, the political world was in chaos. The Democratic Party, once united behind Omar, found itself deeply divided. Some rallied to her defense, while others quietly distanced themselves, sensing the storm was too powerful to weather. Even AOC, who had been Omar's closest ally, struggled to maintain her position in the face of mounting evidence. The public was unforgiving, and the pressure on Omar continued to mount. Karoline Leavitt, having set this chain of events in motion, had become a figure of fierce determination. She had been unrelenting in her pursuit of justice, and her name was now synonymous with political integrity in the eyes of her supporters. But Karoline knew that her battle was far from over. While the charges against Omar were undeniable, the true test would come in the final moments: the courtrooms, the legal verdicts, and the ultimate political fallout. In a dramatic final turn of events, the Department of Homeland Security's investigation came to a head when the grand jury formally indicted Ilhan Omar on multiple counts of immigration fraud, conspiracy, and perjury. It was a historic moment, an elected official facing criminal charges for misrepresenting her entry into the country. It wasn't just the end of a political career, it was the end of a chapter in the political landscape of the United States. Omar, once a rising star in progressive circles, found herself at a crossroads. The pressure was unbearable. She had always prided herself on her fight for justice, but now it was clear that her own actions had betrayed the very principles she had championed. In a final attempt to salvage something of her reputation, Ilhan made a public statement, but it was different from her earlier defiant speeches. This time, there was no bravado. There was only resignation. "I have made mistakes," she admitted, her voice trembling with emotion. "And while I stand by my work and my commitment to this country, I recognize that the charges against me are serious. I will face the consequences of my actions, whatever they may be. My work in Congress is over, but my fight for justice, for equality, for the people who have supported me, will continue." The words hung in the air, and for the first time, it seemed as if Ilhan Omar understood the gravity of the situation. The powerful figure who had once dominated political debates now seemed small, vulnerable, and broken. The room around her was silent, and for the first time in years, there was no applause. There was only the weight of the truth. But it wasn't just the end for Ilhan Omar. For Karoline Leavitt, it was the conclusion of a battle she had fought with unmatched persistence. She had done what many had considered impossible, she had brought accountability to the highest levels of government, and she had stood firm in the face of overwhelming opposition. In the aftermath of the indictment, Karoline held a press conference where she addressed the nation. The room was packed with reporters, and Karoline's face was resolute. She knew that, in this moment, she had changed the course of American politics. Today, justice has prevailed, Karoline began, her voice clear and steady. We have seen that no one, no matter how powerful or influential, is above the law. The investigation into Congresswoman Ilhan Omar was not about politics, it was about accountability. It was about the integrity of our system, and today, we take a step toward ensuring that integrity remains intact. Karoline paused, letting the gravity of her words sink in. She knew this moment would be remembered as one of the defining moments of her career. We all have a responsibility to uphold the law, and when one of us falls short of that responsibility, we must hold them accountable. This isn't about partisanship. This is about the American people. This is about restoring faith in our government. Her words resonated across the nation. Karoline Leavitt had become a political force in her own right, and many viewed her as the future of the Republican Party. But for Karoline, this wasn't about power, it was about principles. As the news broke that Ilhan Omar would be forced to step down from Congress and face the consequences of her actions, the political world took a collective breath. The repercussions of the scandal would be felt for years to come, not just in Washington, but across the country. The debate over immigration laws, government transparency, and political accountability would become more urgent than ever. For Karoline, the fight wasn't over. She had achieved a victory, but there were more battles ahead. She was already planning her next moves, knowing that the fight for integrity in politics would continue. As for Ilhan Omar, the next chapter of her life was uncertain, but one thing was clear, she would no longer be the voice of the progressive movement. Her legacy had been forever altered. The nation had watched as the political titans clashed, and in the end, it was accountability that had won the day. The final reckoning had arrived.